Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this workshop. I'm Trudy Lang from the Global Health Network, and I'm delighted to welcome the team from the ReMAP-CAP study group, who will introduce themselves shortly. We have run a series of these workshops around the COVID-19 pandemic. The overall objective is to try and increase the activity in terms of research that's happening across the globe, especially in low and middle income countries, to try and make sure that research is equitable and opportunities exist everywhere to answer all these critical unknowns that we have. One really important area is obviously trying to run clinical trials within the window of this pandemic. And we have got to know, many around the world have got to know the work of the ReMAP-CAP team. And we believe this is a really important trial platform and approach that could stand to answer some of these questions really quickly about what the best interventions are. So what we're doing today is bringing together some of the key people involved with this to tell us all about the ReMAP-CAP study. And the overall objective of today is to try and increase the engagement of researchers across the globe. And that would be a really remarkable opportunity for people to take part who maybe haven't been able to get involved so far. So just a little bit of housekeeping as everybody's signing in. We're going to have three brief overview talks, which I'll introduce in a minute, to tell you about the study design and the aims and some experience of the study in Brazil. And then we'll open it up after half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour, so that we can really have a discussion. And what would be really excellent is if during the talks, or just as it comes to mind, if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button you can see on the bottom of your screen and write up any comments, questions, anything you have, because we're going to be gathering these throughout this workshop, and we can put as many of those questions as we can to the panelists today during the workshop. But we can also keep those for later, and that's proven really helpful. And I think we have over 250 people on this call, either part of the Zoom call or watching on Facebook. And every single one of your comments is important, and we will capture them because we will write them up afterwards if we don't manage to get them all discussed in the time today. The other thing that is also possible is if you want to make a comment or just raise
Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that. If you make it full screen, and then...
I just did. That works. Okay, so we will talk about adaptive platform trials and how they're, I guess, perfectly suited, you could argue, for rapid knowledge generation in a pandemic. John and Fernando will fill in details afterwards. I'll provide sort of more generalities about adaptive platform trials. John will talk about ReMAP-CAP specifically and where it is right now, and Fernando will talk about some implementation issues in various regions. Let me see if this works. As many of you know, there are many trials happening right now. This is a global clinical trial tracker showing that over 1,000 clinical trials dedicated to COVID-19 are active and ongoing currently. The bulk of those, as is visualized, are in East Asia, Europe and in North America, with smaller circles in Africa, South America, and South Asia. If you look at sort of the intervention map, and this clinical trial tracker does that quite nicely, you see that that middle circle with all of the webs going from it is a standard of care. And all of the separate circles are different interventions that are being tested against a placebo or standard of care across these 1,000 plus clinical trials.
Sure, I think you need to, it's not clicking down through your slides for some reason. We're still on the slide number 1.
Is that working there?
No.
No, let me try to stop sharing. I apologize.
That's okay. So we might be able to, I'm sure it's usually fairly glitch free. Let's have a look.
Can you see my screen now?
We can see your first slide and your mouse moving. Ah, yeah, there we are. You're off. Okay, I'll step back.
That's good there?
Yeah, that's slide 2.
I'm moving now. Can you see the moving slides?
If you go on top and go into slideshow.
No, it's not working there. Okay, I'll just go with this.
That's it.
So you see the clinical trials are sort of varied with many comparisons to control, but very few comparisons against each other. The second problem is that many trials are starting and many of them are very small. About 50% of these trials will have sample sizes less than 100 participants. And if you look at hydroxychloroquine specifically, which is obviously a topic of great interest, it's being evaluated in over 100 separate clinical trials, all with very similar aims and similar objectives. A map that came out in the Lancet last week about sort of how these trials are intersecting with each other shows that, say, Kaletra or hydroxychloroquine versus standard of care are very difficult to compare against each other within the context of the ongoing clinical trial apparatus. I don't need to speak to this audience about the need for high quality evidence during a pandemic, and this is a classic slide that we always like to show. A panel is the current response to severe outbreaks, or the previous ones, where the clinical research response is sort of near the tail end of that epi curve as it's onwards on its downward slope. And the ideal circumstance is that that clinical research response is exactly synced up with the operational response, and so the epi curve is appropriately pushed downwards with the availability of high quality evidence that limits mortality and morbidity from the outbreak. I'm being instructed as to how to fix this. The one next to minus. Is that better? And so the problems with doing a pandemic research are many. There's the ethics of a control arm, which in some contexts, in the context of an outbreak or a pandemic, is often deemed to be a challenge. Emerging data is rapidly accruing. And so is there a loss of equipoise with changing standards of care and changing opinions about what that standard of care is? There's the time required to set up a clinical trial, including multi-site and multi-nation coordination, acknowledging contracts and ethics approvals, and so on. The research staff available to consent and randomize in the context of an outbreak or a pandemic is difficult. The willingness to walk into an acute care context and the appropriate amounts of personal protective equipment. For proving a difference in mortality, large numbers are required. And so you need a trial apparatus that's relevant for all settings. And so this balance between learning and doing, which is often deemed to be a dichotomy where you can either do one or the other, where you can learn in the context of a clinical trial, but people at the front lines want to do and provide clinical care as best as possible and provide interventions, given the idea that we should be providing as much as possible to patients. The platform trial is a context of a clinical trial that sort of tests all of these things actively. Oh, I'm being told again, I'm not doing it well. Okay, guys. Hopefully this works. I apologize for the technical issues. The platform trial is something, this is a nice publication in JAMA from a couple of years ago, which sort of goes into what's different about it compared to a traditional trial. And so a traditional trial looks at single agents in a homogeneous population. A platform trial will look at multiple agents in a heterogeneous population, explicitly assuming that the treatment effects may be heterogeneous. And so this idea that heterogeneous treatment effects across populations will help inform the clinical outcomes and the interpretation of the study is a crucial one. And so patients who are less sick versus patients who are more sick will be able to be analyzed within a statistical technique to help understand which patients might get an intervention. A traditional trial is fixed in terms of its time. A platform trial can be conceivably long-term, with new interventions being rolled in accordingly. The number of treatment groups in a traditional trial are sort of pre-specified, generally limited, usually 1 or 2 treatment groups. Platform trials can have multiple, and those things can change over time. Stopping rules. The entire trial for a traditional trial may be stopped early for success. The platform trial, individual treatment groups may be removed based on demonstrated efficacy or futility or harm, but the trial will continue with the addition of new arms. Allocation, traditional trials are fixed. Platform trials can have response adaptive randomization, and we'll talk about what that is in a second. There might be multiple sponsors for a platform trial. Effectively, what it is a trial that can basically be applied across different regions, while a traditional trial is typically supported by a single sponsor, be it a government, institution, or academic. How this works sort of as an evolution of a platform trial over time is you have multiple interventions. I presume that you guys can see this new slide that are tested and randomized and assigned in combination and in the individual. As outcomes accrue, the randomization allocation changes so that in this slide, B and BC, which are bigger, will preferentially get randomized. So patients will preferentially receive the interventions that are doing better. And that subsequently continues until interventions that are doing worse are removed from the randomization schema, so that A and AB, for example, are gone. And so B, B, C, and C are the interventions that are us. I apologize for the slide and technical issues. Let me go back to this. I think this is the best view. I apologize again. So you get preferential allocation to B and C and BC because those are the interventions that are doing the best. In the population perspective, the yellow group there seems like they have no response to any of the interventions, so they can be removed from the randomization schema and get separate interventions assigned to them as data accrues. This is different than a traditional trial in that you start randomization with equal proportions, you analyze data as it comes in. If a statistical trigger is reached, you say there's a platform conclusion, and you publish and present those results accordingly. At the same time, you integrate those results into the platform. And so effectively what you have obtained is a learning system whereby the patients are receiving the optimal standard of care throughout their journey. So in some ways, it has these key design features across the board. It has frequent interim Bayesian analyses. It can test multiple interventions. It has response adaptive randomization, and it can assess for differential treatment effects across different populations, be it severity or other covariates that would impact on outcomes. So those challenges that we discussed earlier, the ethics of control arm, this response adaptive randomization will preferentially, without losing statistical power, randomize patients to the better performing arms. The loss of equipoise with emerging data, the need to rapidly adapt to new arms instead of continuing to study things that have otherwise been proven efficacious or harmful. The time is important, and I think using things that are pre-established networks pre-pandemic, and we'll talk about what ReMAP-CAP has done. The research staff, I think important is embedding this within care as much as possible, making the footprint at sites as minimal as you can, and making the trial infrastructure as clean and easy to operationalize as possible. You need large numbers, and so across countries, across continents, and across regions, and making it relevant for all settings, so easy to implement at the site level with region-specific models, sponsored locally, and the ability to implement regionally relevant questions all within a platform. And so one of the appeals is if there is a question that's relevant, it can be integrated into the platform within one specific region and then studied accordingly. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it on to John, who can share his screen, and hopefully he has less technical problems than I do.
Thanks, Ren. You have me absolutely terrified, but I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let me just find it. Here we are. So I take it that people can see the screen okay?
Yeah, that's great, John. Carry on.
Okay. So what is ReMAP-CAP? ReMAP-CAP is actually a product of the last global pandemic, the influenza H1N1 pandemic in 2009. A number of people had tried to launch clinical trials during the pandemic and found that the timing of a pandemic just doesn't permit all of the steps that need to be undertaken to launch a trial to be completed before the pandemic has kind of run its course. And so we came up with the idea of developing a sort of sleeper trial that would be running in the background and available to be activated at the time of the next pandemic. And obviously that time is now. So REMAP stands for Randomized, Embedded, Multifactorial, Adaptive Platform Trial. And CAP is community-acquired pneumonia. The reason the sleeper trial studied community-acquired pneumonia is that it is the phenotype of most pandemic infections. Certainly COVID-19 fits this very, very nicely. The entry criteria for the trial are pragmatic, simple clinical evidence of pneumonia in association with either respiratory or hemodynamic dysfunction. And the target population is the sickest patients with community-acquired pneumonia. So in peacetime, which was up until the end of January of this year, ReMAP-CAP was unfolding in 4 different continents with 3 different domains being studied for community-acquired pneumonia. One was selection of antibiotics, the empiric antibiotic to be started. For those patients who received a macrolide, there was a separate domain which looked at the duration of macrolide treatment, the hypothesis being that macrolides have immunomodulatory effects and therefore may benefit independent of their antimicrobial activity. And finally, there was a domain that looked at corticosteroids and whether adjunctive corticosteroids improved outcome in severe community-acquired pneumonia. So that was ReMAP-CAP. And again, as I say, it was a sleeper trial intended to be activated at the time of the next pandemic. We had a pandemic appendix to the core protocol, and with the onset of COVID-19, that pandemic appendix has been activated. It's resulted in two significant changes to the trial. One is that the primary focus is patients with COVID-19 infection who have organ dysfunction. The second one is that the primary outcome has shifted to organ support-free days over 21 days, primarily to ensure that the response adaptive randomization occurs in a nimble fashion. It's also expanded its scope. So in addition to those domains that I described before, there are now domains for antiviral therapy, which is lopinavir, ritonavir, hydroxychloroquine, both or neither. And I would comment that the control arm for all of these studies is usual care. There's an immune modulation arm, and currently that includes interferon beta-1a, anakinra, or the interleukin-1 receptor antagonist, tocilizumab, which is an IL-6 receptor antagonist, and sarilumab, another IL-6 receptor antagonist. There's an immunoglobulin domain, which currently includes convalescent plasma, an anticoagulation domain, which is heparin, either standard or low molecular weight, at anticoagulant as opposed to prophylactic doses. A vitamin C domain, which is very high dose vitamin C. There's been some evidence of efficacy in ARDS. And finally, a ventilation domain, which is under construction and hopefully will be available before too long. So this is where ReMAP-CAP stands right now as an international trial. It's recruiting in 173 different sites in Europe, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, with active efforts underway to move it further into Latin America, Brazil in particular, Africa hopefully, and Southeast Asia. Japan may be coming on board as well. As of last night, there had been 926 patients randomized in the trial. 431 of these patients had suspected or proven COVID-19 infection. One of the critical questions I think that a number of us on the ReMAP-CAP team are struggling with right now is the desire to expand what has been a trial primarily of the Northern Hemisphere into the Southern Hemisphere, and to create a ReMAP low and middle income country iteration of the trial, where the domains might include basic support, strategies to avoid intubation, oxygen thresholds, corticosteroids, and some simple interventions that would be widely available and potentially effective. Heparin because of the coagulopathy of COVID-19, vitamin C because of its potential role in acute lung injury. The necessity would be that a data collection process be developed that was really simple and pragmatic. This is a long-term goal of ReMAP-CAP. The E stands for embedded, and the idea is that this could be embedded in the electronic health record so that data were aggregated from that electronic health record. And the notion for a low and middle income country trial would be to approach a major funder to seek this in those particular regions. So I think as Sren has kind of pointed out, we are really changing a lot of our lives as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also fundamentally changing the way that we are thinking about and conducting research. We're looking at new trial designs which are far more collaborative and looking at much, much larger sample sizes. We're looking at trying to harmonize tools, harmonize outcome measures, build new methods of people who previously would work independently, collaborating for a greater global good. We're looking at new models of oversight and reporting. For example, the possibility that those 100 trials of hydroxychloroquine might share their data at interim analyses and therefore reach a conclusion before any one of the individual trials did. And most importantly, the need being to produce results as rapidly as possible so that they can inform patient care. It's one of the beauties of a platform trial is that inherent in the model is that it is constantly adapting so that patients are more likely to benefit either through response adaptive randomization or through the immediate uptake of the study results. So I think it's an exciting, challenging, frightening time. Thank you, and I will cease sharing my screen.
Thank you, John. That's excellent overview. So this is perfect to hand over to Fernando now, who can share his experience of how this is all working out for him in reality in Brazil. So over to you, Fernando.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Very specific points for how to get a trial running on a low middle income country. So of course, as you know, when people say, well, let's run a trial in Brazil, my first question is always which Brazil? Because Brazil is a very unequal country with varying degrees of human development index and education index across the country. So we have some places that have a very high human development index and some places that are still struggling, although the most are getting better in the past decades. So of course, Brazil is a good example because some of the issues that John pointed before are very pressing for some parts of the country, and things that are possible in some regions are probably not possible in the others. And of course, since it's a very big country, other issues to deploy a clinical trial are also pressing, including logistics and other points that I will briefly address. I hope I'm not taking more than 5 to 10 minutes here. So we have some very big challenges in getting a large clinical trial running here. And of course, ReMAP-CAP is, as John said, probably the most ethical, correct, and proper way to run a clinical trial in the context of a pandemic, because you can really deploy a lot of interventions. You can borrow information using the Bayesian framework, and that's probably better for everyone. But of course, this kind of design is new, and as everything that's new, some people may have some issues. Mostly, it's not because people can be a little bit suspicious on the design of the trial. And of course, much of what we have done and what we try to do is how to inform people that this is the correct way to run things. So one thing, I have some full points, and of course, these points can be extrapolated for other places. But one important point is how to explain the trial for both ethics committees and regulatory agencies. So of course, low middle income countries do not have a research output that's as high as the northern hemisphere. So some ethics committees and some regulatory agencies may have some lack of experience with both external collaborations, and these includes data sharing, for example, which is a very pressing point. So who holds the data? In Brazil, there's a very important point. So Brazil has recently adopted a data protection law that's similar to the European law. So who holds the data? Where will the data be stored? Who has access to this data? So this is a pressing point for some countries, and this is a pressing point in Brazil. Some ethics committees and regulatory agencies, they are used to have, that brick trials where we have those large trials that, as been mentioned before, we have a fixed sample size, we have a date, so the the community and the regulatory agencies can just have an answer. So everyone is craving for an answer, and sometimes explaining to people that adaptive trials are designed to provide an answer along the way and not at fixed time points. It takes some time. So some regulatory agencies are still very fond of, p lower than 0.05 values and that all or nothing approaches. So this is a very important point. But of course, when you show the experience from other countries and for other places, and you show that this is moving, most of the people can understand this, because this all makes sense and this all is important for providing quick answers. Another point that's been mentioned before is funding. So this is true in Brazil, and I believe this is true for most low middle income countries. Funding is always problematic around here. So we have very few funding lines in Brazil, and most of these funding lines, they are not very usual. They're not very habituated to this funding share that is required for a platform trial. So how can okay, let's say I ask for funding from the government, and I say, well, I'm going to be part of this trial, which is a global effort. And sometimes they just require who is the main actor here, who is the one that runs the trial, and why aren't we running our trial, and why it's important for us to join a global trial. So this still happens. Of course, this is improving fast, but that can be an issue, especially when funding is scarce. So why would the government give funding, or why would the funding source fund a trial that is a global effort instead of a local initiative? So again, here, the key point is to say how important it is to provide quick answers for mankind and for the pandemic. And of course, the more countries are involved, the greater the external validity of the answers. So this is a very important point. So instead of, as has been shown before, running several small trials with 100 patients here and there, joining a global effort is better, and the return in terms of answers per money spent, that can be really maximized by joining a platform trial instead of doing multiple local researches. Of course, there are some other issues that we came across when we started to propose in trials in Brazil. So one issue during the pandemic is how to obtain consent form for these patients. So in Brazil, for example, we still have some illiterate people that it's hard to get consent. So we need witnesses to read the text. Sometimes, usually when this happens, we usually call the family in, but of course the family sometimes here is not allowed to visit the patients because of the pandemic. So this can be a little bit tricky to obtain. And another point that we came across is how to obtain consent form from patients on contact precautions. So for example, in Brazil, the rule was to have a paper-filled consent form. So the patient signs, and we keep it for a long time. So, but how to do that when it's not advisable for patients and to use papers, and how to keep these papers and these consent forms? They are probably contaminated materials, so there's a biological hazard in keeping these. So some alternative that may work for some countries, for example, emailed consent forms or verbal consent forms, etc. They are not a rule around here. So some patients do not have email addresses here. Digitally signed documents are usually not accepted in Brazil. But a good point is that during this pandemic, this moved a lot forward. So some of the trials we are running, so we could explain these to regulatory agencies that we needed to better ways and safer ways, not only for the patients, but for the healthcare staff on how to obtain consent forms. So, of course, the pandemic is in this sense, is a window of opportunity to improve clinical transparency and to improve the way we obtain consent form for this patient. So this is probably a good time to do that. I have two final points here, and I'm not going to go much further on this, is the question of logistics. This is very pressing in Brazil. So, for example, we do not have, most ICUs do not have a dedicated research personnel. So it's uncommon to have, let's say, a research nurse or a research fellow on the ICUs or even in the hospital. So every time you say, well, let's run a trial, probably you're going to impose a burden of data collection to a patient, to a healthcare worker. So this is a problem that sometimes needs to be tackled. The funding can be used, for example, to maybe hire someone and to make someone to collect the data, but that's a problem. And of course, in Brazil, this also comes with additional issues like how to make drugs arrive at the site. So during the pandemic, how do I make a drug arrive from, let's say, São Paulo city to the north of Brazil, to Manaus, or to the northeast? So during the pandemic, if we are going to test drugs, we have few flights moving along now. It takes a lot of time. So Brazil is a very big country. So how to make the devices or the drugs arrive at the proper place at the proper time to make the trial run. So this is another challenge. And of course, this depends on perhaps starting small and going slow and increase capillarity of the research along the way. And finally, my final remark is that the ReMAP-CAP is a great opportunity to provide good answers that are correct and may avoid excessive burdens to already overstressed the healthcare system. So every time a new drug comes in and people start to do compassionate use outside a clinical trial, this drives attention away from other very important aspects of care that are really more pressing, like good bedside nurses, like data collection and research questions. And of course, evaluating a drug or device inside a trial provides a fair answer to the sites. So it provides a fair answer like, well, this has a very good clinical benefit, or we are pretty sure of a relevant clinical benefit. As John said, we are talking about organ support-free days, mortality. So these are endpoints that are relevant for the community, that are relevant for the healthcare system. So they are probably more relevant than surrogate endpoints like, viral load or things like that. So this is a very good chance to engage people in doing research that provides the answers that both clinicians, patients, and the healthcare system requires. So of course, we have a lot of issues in low and middle income countries, but of course, this is, regardless of all the problems, this is a good time and we need to move forward. So all these questions and these problems can be tackled, and tackling these issues inside the clinical trial and inside a working group is probably much more useful than doing individual researches here and there. So this is what I had to say. So thank you all very much. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll move forward. Thank you.
Well done. That was absolutely wonderful to hear how you are managing this in Brazil and how important it is to do these studies. Now, we've had a really great, rich list of questions coming in on the Q&A tab and within the chat. In the time we've got left, we've got 20 minutes, which is excellent. Let's pick up some of these topics between any of you panelists. There's some broad themes coming out, but also there's a hand up. So in no particular order, could one of you pick up the importance of public engagement in running trials like this, and getting the trust of the community, so community engagement, public engagement, and how you might tackle this, or any comments you want to make? I don't mind which of you pick that up.
It's John. I mean, it's a critically important topic to be thinking about, and probably there's a unique opportunity here, because I suspect there's nobody in the public that is not only thinking about but obsessed with the challenges of COVID-19 and the uncertainties it brings. I'm not an expert in how one actually builds that engagement, but I think that the concept is critical.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there's lots of opportunities here actually for where groups are doing community engagement, maybe to share their approaches. And I know there's lots of work going on in different settings, and we're beginning to share some of those tools up on the platform. So yeah, how have you approached community engagement in Brazil, Fernando?
So, this is always an important point. So how to get the public to, of course, we all know that there's a lot of politics involved in COVID-19. So, but of course, people are very, people are willing to help. So we had very good experiences with both the national ethics committees and the national regulatory agencies in Brazil. They were extremely helpful when we approached them for other trials and for other discussions during COVID-19. So I guess I talked a lot about the diversities in running a clinical trial in a low middle income country, but of course you can have great surprises. So actually at this point, if you just ask people for help, sometimes you get wonderful responses. So we had a very good background, a very good return from the national ethics committees in Brazil and the regulatory agencies, and they all seem very keen to help. So one thing that is important is to create a momentum here for this. So what worked well in Brazil is gathering a group of researchers. We have a network that does research in Brazil, which is a BRICnet, and go for your local ethics committee and ask for guidance and ask for, well, we heard about this, we want to join ReMAP-CAP, how can we do that? So, and understand your local limitations in the sense that it's okay if you cannot join everything, and it's okay to start low and perhaps go slow, but you have to try. So what worked here was, an everyday work to get people on board and to talk to key people and make everyone understand that this is correct, that this is a proper way to do research. It's time to get even political and academic issues aside for this pandemic. So it's not the time to go to remain belligerent to academic things. So it's a time to join people and to join people from different institutions, create a small coalition in your country and ask for the guidance. And I guess everyone, if you do that, if you talk to people, I guess most people will return positively. So even in Brazil, when we are having a very hard time with COVID-19 here, we have some very nice glimpses of goodwill and good return from the society. So I guess the first thing is talk about research and tell people why research is important in every way you can, and why this is the ethical way to test things. So the society needs to test ethical things.
Thank you. We can definitely come back to that in some more of the discussions, maybe offline. I just want to jump to a question that I think might touch on some other points, and it would be great if people listening, the attendees, would like to chip in on this too, because it would be great to hear from you. And if you want to make a comment, just click the raised hand, because it would be good to hear from you too. One of the attendees here is from Kenya, and made the point that that they can do good quality trials, obviously, in Kenya, but it's obviously a malaria endemic country as well. And this crosses over for one of the workshops we did a couple of weeks ago on the need to look at the importance of co-infections and comorbidity with COVID-19, not just at the disease characteristics that might change, but also in what treatments and vaccines might look like in that context. And so I think that was a really important point to raise. And I just would really like to hear from many of the people attending, but perhaps each of you might pick up that question, because I think not just for malaria, but other comorbidities and why it's important.
I don't know if John wants to talk a little bit about it, but of course, yeah. So in Brazil, that's a problem. That's an issue too, because we have other diseases as well. So during summer, we have yellow fever, dengue, Zika, and other diseases, and of course, sometimes these things bundle up. So. But I guess, well, I don't know if John wants to make a word on this, but it can be done. In Brazil, we have a very seasonal profile of diseases, both in summer and winter. Of course, since it's a very large country, we have some local particularities, but of course that bundling up other diseases would be, I believe, interesting.
John, Sharon, do you want to come in with a comment on that?
Sorry, I'm furiously typing away at the Q&As in the background. If the issue is assessing for comorbidities, I think it's an important one. One of the covariates that ReMAP-CAP embeds is that, and so we'll be able to assess through our modeling what covariates will help sort of mediate outcomes as much as possible.
And John?
I have nothing too much to add to that. I mean, I think the challenges are substantially different in tropical regions. The coexisting infections that we deal with are going to be influenza or community-acquired pneumonia, as opposed to malaria and some of the more tropical infections. But no question, it makes the diagnosis and management, it raises separate issues that are important.
Great. So I'll just jump to different topics, and Shrin, well done for working so hard answering these questions in the background. We're going to capture all of those, but it's good to just talk through some of them as well and offer others the chance to comment. I just want to jump to a couple of the sort of more study management issues. There's been comments around DSMBs, data safety monitoring boards, whether there's a central or local requirement, and I'd just be interested to hear from all three of you about DSMBs, but also maybe just study oversight overall, and how there might be some support maybe for countries with less experience, because obviously there's a need for local oversight, but it could be that there might be some knowledge sharing and support that can happen there. So it'd just be good to hear from all three of you on that one, and if anybody wants to contribute, please raise your hand on the discussion. So maybe John, do you want to go first on that one?
Sure. I can comment a bit about the Data Safety Monitoring Board for REMAP-CAP. There is an international Data Safety Monitoring Board that in the pandemic version of the trial reviews information on a very regular basis. In fact, they had a meeting yesterday afternoon, but they are also empowered, independent of the trial, to report the emerging findings to public health authorities, so that there is actually a very agile pathway for the trial to make its evolving insights available to those who have to make decisions about how best to manage patients. The other thing I would comment is that we, through the WHO Clinical Characterization and Management Working Group, we've been working on a project that is seeking to bring together representation from DSMBs of multiple different trials studying a similar intervention. So we're starting with corticosteroid trials. There are about 8 of them currently underway. And the idea is that we're trying to find a mechanism for those data safety monitoring boards to pool their data at the time of interim analyses so that they could see if there is an aggregate signal for particularly for harm, but also potentially for benefit emerging that might merit premature disclosure of results so that patients could be more likely to benefit in real time. And data safety monitoring boards play a critical role, I think, in clinical trials, and they're absolutely essential to have, and all the more so. But I think the requirements in pandemic research really extend beyond simply the protection of the individual subjects in the trial. I mean, that is part of the remit, but it's also understanding how the evolving information informs the management of a problem which is a political and public health problem and not just an individual patient concern.
That's great. Shirin, do you want to comment on that as well?
Sure, and I think the concept, to add to that, the concept of capacity sharing in the context of ensuring appropriate local oversights and helping DSMBs sort of navigate if they don't have that kind of familiarity is crucial. And I think without a doubt, that would be part of the remit of this program. Given some of the novelties of it is to help scale out some of the ability to, say, approve adaptive trials or acknowledge what they need to do and sort of scale that out accordingly.
Great, thank you. I think maybe we could just move on. So there's been a few questions around standard of care and obviously how that varies. I just wondered if probably all three of you might want to make a quick comment on how that works with implementing the studies in different settings.
I mean, I think it's a reality of the world that we do things differently. Certainly, it's within the ReMAP-CAP model. We've simply accepted that the comparator would be standard of care, whatever that standard is. Capturing the elements of variability is complicated, and it is potentially a source of unmeasured impact on a treatment effect. But I think that hopefully it contributes noise rather than significant, a strict bias to the results of studies.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that plays to the point as well. I think we've hopefully heard loud and clear through this about, again, why it's important to do studies in so many different settings and recognizing the different, level of care in various settings, but also the different approaches. Does Shirin or Fernando want to come add anything to that as well?
I guess the best way, so this is yet another reason to do the trial in several places. So the best way, so this is going to increase external validity of the trial. And of course, standard of care varies a lot. And that's, as John said, that is true for all clinical trials. It varies a lot inside the country, sometimes inside the hospital. But the beauty of randomization is that you can consider, of course, this will be probably balanced, or at least the risks of the patient will be balanced in the end. So of course, inside a Bayesian framework, it's easier to consider these aspects than in a traditional frequencies framework. So, of course, we probably the ReMAP-CAP models will consider that there are these clusters, or each country has a a random effect inside the models. So I guess this is a strength and not a weakness at all. So. Because a good intervention must be valid anywhere, so valid for most countries. So I guess this is a strength. The fact that we have very different backgrounds, and it's far from being a weakness. Of course, there are some devices that we cannot tolerate, but that's the strength of the trial. The fact that we can test an intervention in many different backgrounds with patients with different comorbidity profiles. So that's a strength. That's another reason to do a global trial.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's I hope that that point's come across. In the last couple of minutes we've got left, I just really quickly want to touch on ethics committees and research review panels, because I know there are a lot of people who are members of ethics committees on this workshop today. Panelists, can you really call out how the role that local ethics committees have to play in this pandemic, maybe not just for ReMAP-CAP, but for any research, and how they can help facilitate studies happening within this very important window to do research? Just briefly, because I've got a final big question for you all after that. So maybe Shrin, if you could go first.
Like, obviously, it's hugely important, and every ethics board will assess this differently. And I think part of sort of the Global Health Network and ethics group within that is to sort of help scale out some of the education that's going to be required for these novel trial designs. Because I think local oversight and local expertise in these contexts is going to be very important for this to be successful.
Very nice. John?
Well, I think I'm struck by the fact that research ethics boards have bent over backward to be as responsive as possible to the needs of clinical trials that are being launched rapidly during the pandemic. But I think it's also exposing a shortcoming of the research ethics model and its application to pandemic research, because the issues are not just those of the protection of individual patients within a clinical trial, they're also the protection of the populace of a society in the face of an emerging pandemic, which speaks to issues of resource availability and multiple things like that. And it's simply not part of the way that REBs approach things. So that I think rethinking the research ethics model in a pandemic and thinking about it from not an individual hospital perspective, which is where it tends to be right now, at least in our country, but more from a national perspective, I think is going to be an important issue.
Great. Fernando, just a quick comment, and I've got a last question for you all.
So I guess, I don't know, I guess this has been great. So I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be involved, and I'm absolutely free. Of course, we are absolutely free to help anyone that's willing to join and to share my experiences with dealing with some more resource constrained settings in other countries. So if everyone needs some guidance, and if I can be useful for anyone in the community, I'm absolutely free. So feel free to get in touch with me by Twitter or something, so I can share. Of course, we need some local answers, so some things that work in Brazil might not work in other countries, but of course perhaps we can I can share some experiences and help paving a way, so we are all in this together in the same. This is a very pressing point, so thank you very much once again.
Thank you. So John and Shrin, this is really for you. I think we've had a few people through the chats and questions make clear that they'd really like to get involved, and I'm sure after this workshop others will come forward. And one of the things we're doing anyway with the Global Health Network is setting up working groups, and we can think about setting up a working group around supporting ReMAP-CAP if that's useful, but certainly we're going to have a working group on clinical trial implementation, and we could have ReMAP-CAP within that. We can look at how that might work. But just in brief, just to finish off today, could you just outline what's the best thing to do if there are researchers on here who would like to get involved and see about taking part in this trial with you?
From my perspective, that's a very exciting opportunity, and I would be very keen to pursue it. It's not a question I could answer in a minute, but I would be delighted to spend some time with anybody who's interested pursuing the issues separately.
Great. Shrin, that covers that?
Yes, exactly. Conversations, very important, very excited.
Excellent. Well, look at that. We're right on the hour. We've had a fantastic set of exchanges on the chat. Well done, Srin, and people working behind the scenes answering the questions. We do have quite a nice process of writing these up as a report, so we'll capture it all. This has been a really, really important topic to cover, and it would be just wonderful if it ends up with new sites taking part and getting data from a wider field. So panelists, thank you very much. We hope this drives your amazing study forward even further, and thank you everybody for listening on Facebook, and obviously all the attendees, and do continue to contribute on the platform, and we hope we can take this forward. Thank you very much, everybody.